Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining this session. I think Tim made it pretty clear that I'm going to pick up exactly where he left off, and hopefully a lot of the questions that you were asking Tim just now, I might be able to go some way to answer based on the additional analysis that we've done. So, as well as measuring the extent to which Australians are exposed to fringe and radical content online, and the degree to which they hold views which might be problematic or potentially harmful, the focus of our radicalisation research program is also on trying to better understand the pathways to radicalised attitudes, intentions and behaviour. In this presentation, I want to share with you the results of two separate but connected AIC studies. So having just established that exposure to fringe and radical content is relatively common among online Australians, especially on mainstream platforms, I'll start by focusing on whether that exposure is associated with increased support for the use of violence to achieve collective goals. I'm going to answer the question to some extent that Tim put to you, which is, should we be concerned about these findings? In the second half of the presentation, I'm going to draw on a separate or related study which focuses specifically on the role of anti-government sentiment and conspiratorial thinking in shaping people's support for violence. And I do want to acknowledge the contribution of both Tim and also Siobhan Lawler, I'm not sure if Siobhan's here, to the research I'm presenting today. Oops. So these issues, Tim's already shown these, but these issues were both explored as part of the work we undertook on behalf of the Five Eyes Law Enforcement Group, where we explored the vulnerability to radicalisation amongst anti-authority protesters. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the issue that we're talking about, there was a significant focus on the online environment as part of that work, given the important role that mis and disinformation had obviously played in shaping the attitudes and behaviours of the people who protested. Anti-authority protesters were much more likely to have intentionally accessed fringe and radical content and groups online, and they were also much more likely to hold conspiratorial beliefs and had much more negative attitudes towards government. On the balance of these findings and the presence of various other risk and protective factors for radicalised attitudes, we established that these protesters were more vulnerable to radicalisation. This isn't a new issue. I mean, we keep talking about the emergence of harmful content online, and it's not a new issue. Everyone in this room will be well aware that the internet is used by violent extremists to communicate with each other and the general public, to distribute propaganda, radicalise and recruit at-risk people, and raise funds and plan attacks. The AIC published the findings from a large-scale review of, among other things, internet-facilitated radicalisation. And that research showed that exposure to extremist content online and engagement with other violent extremists using the internet was associated with violent extremist attitudes and behaviours. And it cited studies showing that as many as 60% of violent extremists either radicalised primarily online or had significant online influences in their radicalisation. There's now UK data that says that figure's upwards over 90%. The general consensus has been that violent content or exposure to violent content is a risk factor for radicalisation rather than, acts as more as a contributory factor rather than as a direct cause. But we have relatively limited Australian data on the problem, and of course, as Tim has just illustrated, we've seen an explosion of mis and disinformation and extremist content online by malicious actors that is reaching a fairly significant audience. Now, what's concerning about the impact of this content becoming so widely available is not just the fact that it's reaching people who might otherwise never be exposed to these kinds of ideas, messages and influences. It's the speed with which this information can be shared and the speed with which communities share it and shape people's ideologies in a way that might lead them to not only hold radical attitudes or radical beliefs, but ultimately lead to acts of violence because of these beliefs. And it's this speed with which this can occur that makes it extremely difficult, obviously, to intervene. So the issue has obviously attracted substantial attention, most obviously last year with the action taken by eSafety in response to X hosting footage of the Wakely Bishop Mari Emanuel being stabbed. And the eSafety Commissioner was really clear in saying that the reason they issued a takedown or removal notice and then pursued legal action against X when they didn't comply was to prevent this violent footage from going viral, potentially inciting further violence and inflicting more harm on the Australian community. And they are obviously particularly concerned about the influence that could have over younger people. And that, of course, raises the question, what impact does exposure to this type of content have on people, particularly in terms of their willingness to support the use of collective violence to achieve some sort of ideological goal? And that's the focus of this first study that I'm going to share with you. Now, I think it's really important to make clear that we're not just measuring blanket exposure without considering the different patterns of online behaviour that Tim described as part of his presentation. So first, we measured the effect of intentional and unintentional exposure to both violent and non-violent fringe and radical content. And second, we measured the effect of unintentional exposure to, intentional access and membership to online groups that promote fringe and radical content. And then we also measured the effect of having either immediate family members or friends who were sharing or accessing, fringe and radical content online. So not only are we able to measure the effect of violent and non-violent content and whether passive exposure is harmful, but we're able to explore whether participation in online groups, which really become echo chambers that promote and reaffirm harmful beliefs and attitudes, and the degree to which other people in a social network are exposed to this content, whether any of these factors together or individually have an influence over whether someone is likely to support the use of violence. So in this study, we take a slightly different approach to what Tim presented, where we create several mutually exclusive categories to measure the different intent and type of exposure to fringe and radical content and groups online. What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that people who intentionally access content online, especially those who said it was violent, account for a very small proportion of our overall respondents. And the same is true for those people who intentionally access fringe groups and become members of them. Also, I'm going to make the point that we retain people in our study who didn't disclose whether they access content. And we had a suspicion that they were probably an important group and that there was a reason for them not disclosing that. And as it turns out, I'm not going to focus on that, but as it turns out, that's exactly what we observed. And again, Tim mentioned this, but we measured for support for violence using the Violent Extremist Attitude Scale, which is a widely used measure of radicalised attitudes. And it involves asking 4 questions about a person's willingness to encourage, endorse, condone, justify or support the use of violence to achieve political, ideological, religious, social or economic goals. And I've included 2 of the items on the slide. What this shows is that 33% of respondents who intentionally accessed fringe and radical content online agreed or strongly agreed that sometimes people have to resort to violence to defend their values, convictions or religious beliefs. And 22% agreed that it's okay to support groups that use violence to fight injustices. Now, what's really important about this is this was clearly much higher than our other respondents, including those who'd been intentionally accessed non-violent content and those who had been unintentionally exposed to either violent or non-violent content. But of course, there's lots of other factors that might explain this relationship, including the myriad other factors that have been shown to be associated with the risk that someone will develop radicalised attitudes. So we have to control for these as part of our analysis, and we do this by turning to the best contemporary evidence of what we know about risk and protective factors for cognitive and behavioural radicalisation. So we drew upon the Campbell Review by Wolfowitz and colleagues. They identified more than 100 risk and protective factors for radical attitudes. And we identified all of the risk and protective factors that we measured in our survey, of which there were more than 30. And these fall into 5 domains that you can see on the slide: socio-demographic factors, psychological and personality factors, attitudinal factors, criminogenic factors, and experiential factors. And we then created a kind of measure of known risk and protective factors for each respondent. I'm not going to give the detail of the analysis, but I want to just say that what we did was we built a statistical model that essentially controls for these risk and protective factors and allows us to isolate the effects of exposure to fringe and radical content online groups, and also friend and family exposure to fringe and radical content. And what our results showed that after controlling for other risk and protective factors, people who intentionally access fringe and radical content, particularly violent content, were significantly more likely to support the use of violence. Unintentional exposure, irrespective of whether it was violent or not violent, was not associated with increased support for violence. Respondents who said they'd intentionally accessed or were members of online groups promoting fringe and radical content online were also more likely to support the use of violence. And again, there was no relationship between unintentional exposure to these groups and support for violence. And there was a relationship between whether someone's friends were known to have accessed content that mainstream society and government might describe as fringe and radical, and support for violence, but no such relationship for family members. And we also showed, which is a nice kind of test of faith validity, that respondents with more known risk factors or fewer known protective factors were also more likely to support the use of violence. What's important, though, is that while intentionally accessing violent, fringe and radical content was associated with increased support for violence, support was highest amongst people who were exposed to violent, fringe and radical content and who exhibited other risk factors for radicalisation. And so this is kind of the point that I was making at the beginning of the presentation, which is exposure to violent content is a risk factor for radicalisation, but it acts more as a contributory factor than a root cause. So we should be most concerned about not just people who are intentionally accessing violent content, but also who would demonstrate other characteristics that might increase their likelihood of developing radicalised attitudes. Now, so far I've talked a lot about the risk that comes from exposure to certain online content or groups online, but I haven't really talked about the why, and this is the stuff that Tim was talking about at the end of his presentation. How does this content influence people to the point where they'd be willing to support the use of violence? To understand this, we need to shift our focus to the role that anti-government sentiment and conspiratorial thinking has in shaping whether someone has radicalised attitudes. And these are unsurprisingly themes that continue to be present among the extremist actors that ASIO is most concerned about. And really as a common theme since the pandemic, the ASIO Director General highlighted again this year and last year that the role of anti-government and anti-authority ideologies inspired by conspiratorial thinking was present in both annual threat assessments and have been really since the pandemic. So I want to be really clear here, and I think it's important to distinguish what we mean by anti-government sentiment. I'm not talking about whether people are satisfied or not with the performance of the government of the day, or any of the discourse that might surround normal political debate. When I refer to anti-government sentiment, I'm referring to extreme views about the state of our institutions and democratic processes. So for the purpose of this study, we define and measure 3 domains within anti-government sentiment: complete dissatisfaction with democracy, high levels of perceived corruption among politicians, and the belief that votes are only occasionally or never never counted fairly in an election. And as you can see, these views are held by a minority of people. We also, as part of this study, measured whether people believe that mainstream media reports in a biased or false manner. You've seen these before, but rather than measure people's belief in conspiracy theories, we measure conspiratorial thinking. By this, we mean the belief in some non-specific features of the way society functions. So the belief that secret societies control the world, big events like wars, recessions, and elections are controlled by small groups secretly working against us, and that one that everyone chuckles to, that elites use microchips to track and affect the behaviour of the people in the community. And we use these items to create an overall score measuring the degree of conspiratorial thinking. We then analyse the relationship between conspiratorial thinking and support for collective violence, using a very similar approach to the study I've just described to you before, including controlling for other factors. What we found is that conspiratorial thinking has a direct and relatively large effect on a person's support for collective violence, even after controlling for other factors. It's a little more complicated than that, though. When we repeated the analysis with our measures of anti-government sentiment and perceived media bias, our findings were largely as expected. So someone who was completely dissatisfied with democracy, had high levels of perceived corruption amongst politicians, who believed that votes were never or only occasionally counted fairly, or who perceived mainstream media as being biased and reporting in a false manner, they were much more likely to support violence to achieve some collective goal. But when we add conspiratorial thinking into our model, the effect of these variables on support for violence was greatly diminished. So when we use something called mediation analysis, we're able to show that nearly half of the relationship between dissatisfaction with democracy and perceived corruption among politicians and support for violence was explained by the presence of conspiratorial thinking. And almost all of the relationship between perceived media bias and violence supportive attitudes was explained by this conspiratorial thinking. The effect of conspiratorial thinking on the relationship between perceived fairness of elections and support for violence works slightly differently. So when we added conspiratorial thinking, I've got to stop saying that word, to our model, the effect of perceived electoral fairness was flipped, telling us we needed to consider the interaction between these two variables. It's a different type of statistical analysis. What we found was that whether perceived electoral fairness influenced support for violence depended on how much you engaged in conspiratorial thinking. And this only mattered for people who thought elections were sometimes or mostly counted fairly, which is interesting, right? What we think is that these are probably the people who, when the vote goes in their favour, believe an election is fair, but when the preferred party loses, believe it was somehow because the election was rigged. Now, this probably resonates with people, especially with what we've all seen in the US, but I think it's important to point out that the actual effect is relatively small. We need to be a little bit cautious lesson from research generally about interpreting something that's statistically significant, but perhaps not substantively important. And what I mean by this is that it's pretty clear from this study that conspiratorial thinking is the thing that matters most here. It's the underlying driver of support for violence. So, exposure to fringe and radical content is common among online Australians. That's true. This includes acts or content that contains acts of violence. That's true. There are people who intentionally view this content and who participate in online communities that frequently share this material with other internet users, although they're in the minority. We also know that a significant minority of online Australians engage in conspiratorial thinking, including those who also hold strong anti-government sentiment. Our research has shown that intentional access to violent content and participation in online groups is associated with increased support for violence. Unintentional exposure, and I think this is important because we do worry about the breadth of exposure, but unintentional exposure was not related to support for violence. And the relationship between intentional exposure and radicalised attitudes was conditional on there being other risk factors for radicalisation present. It's a kind of melting pot of factors that work together. Conspiratorial thinking was associated with increased support for violence and also explains much of the relationship between anti-government sentiment and violence supportive attitudes. Now, I want to be really clear in saying that what we don't know the direction of these relationships from a cross-sectional study, and that's part of why we have a longitudinal component as part of the newest survey where we can start to unpack the direction of these things. Similarly, these findings don't mean that intentional exposure to violent content or fringe groups or conspiratorial thinking will inevitably lead someone to commit an act of extreme violence. But nevertheless, I think our findings still illustrate the importance of measures that can prevent, reduce or counteract the effects of and attraction of fringe and radical content or conspiratorial content online to people who are particularly vulnerable to radicalisation. And so in that sense, we need to adopt strategies that have been shown to work and which can tackle both the supply and demand. So the removal of harmful websites and content, counter-narrative messages, and in the case of conspiratorial thinking, inoculation strategies are all needed as part of a wider strategy to counteract the effect of harmful content online. I'm going to leave it there. I love my QR codes. The research that I've mentioned is at the beginning of the presentation is all available via our QR code, and obviously, as Tim said, we look forward to publishing the research from the survey and also from the research I've just talked about later this year. So thanks very much for listening.